I was very lucky. I had started to think about questions of happiness really, I think, in the late 1990s. And in the early, thousands, whatever you call it, 2000s, in the early 2000s, I was very lucky to be able to bring together a group of people from psychiatry, from philosophy, from economics, and so many other disciplines. We had a little study group to bring together work and questions having to do with happiness. And that taught me so much. And a number of those individuals have since published their books on happiness. And I just feel I have learned so much from them. Also theology, by the way. And so that when I finally decided to write my own book, I was very glad to be able to draw on all the work that these different people had done, and very much also indeed on theology, because of course in religion happiness has played a huge role, for sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, about what you should do about happiness. But coming back to brain science, so much was being done already and is still being done to measure very carefully brain responses, sometimes right away when, let's say, you were having a happy experience or watching perhaps a video about some terribly unhappy experience. All of those measurements were becoming possible. At the same time, also statistics, questionnaires in different countries and all around the world about people's experience of happiness. And there were two very important separate kinds of questions. One is, how happy might you feel about your own life looking back, wherever you are in your existence, 20s, 30s, 40s, old age? How happy are you looking back at your life? That's one thing. A very different thing is what kinds of experience of happiness and unhappiness have you had during the past day? And those are so different. And we all know, we can go through, each of us, just thinking right now, we can think, and I often do. In fact, one of the great experts on psychologists writing about happiness, who himself is something of a depressive, he says every night when he goes to bed, he asks himself, what has been some of the happy experiences during the day? And I would presume also some of the really bad ones one may have had. So those two are so important to keep apart. And therefore, when people ask you, are you a happy person? This is a really hard question to ask unless you separate those two.
So I've mentioned to you that I think that you've always struck me as a very happy person, and I'm curious about lessons you drew from your work, and then also, sort of in the more immediate moment in the times we're living in. Can you talk a little bit about what brings you joy amid the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Those are so. Could you say those again? Just, I'm sorry. I hope
Sure. No problem. I'm curious about, if you've taken any other lessons away from your own research on happiness, just for yourself. What have you taken from that?
Yes, it mattered so much to me when I was working on the subject of happiness, which indeed, started quite early in the 90s and has gone on and still goes on. I am so interested in reading what people say about happiness, how they talk about their own experience. And in my book on happiness, when I have a chapter called Experience, and it was just wonderful for me to be able to set forth the very different kinds of experience that people have had in their lives, and sometimes momentarily and sometimes for longer. And so, and there, the word experience was so important. And William James, who is a philosopher I so admired, and I was so glad, by the way, coming to study at Harvard, because he had been, of course, a great philosopher and psychologist at Harvard. It was so amazing to me to be in the same university. But William James always rightly said, experience is the most important thing we have to deal with in trying to understand human beings. So the experience of happiness then, to have encountered that in so many novels and accounts, and still, when people talk to me about their own lives, has mattered enormously. And in my own life also, therefore, looking back at my own life, there have been times when there has been great unhappiness. And for me in particular, when my parents were very ill, sometimes I was a continent apart or across the Atlantic Ocean. I would have to fly to them to try to be of help, to see the suffering that they encountered. That was such a difficult time. I was around 50 when my mother in particular was so ill. I was so disturbed that I couldn't even celebrate my 50th birthday. So that was a time of great unhappiness. At the same time, always flying back to my own family, and great happiness in that family. And the combination, and I have a quotation that I thought I would mention, yes, from William Blake, that is so true, I think. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for a soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. Now, he says it all. Those things are together, so it's very hard to separate. Now, if you now talk about pandemic times, this has interested me so much. Here we are, it's just about a year. It is a year, indeed, exactly, since I first realized that it could impact my own life. I flew from where I was in Florida to my home in Cambridge in order to be closer to family and possible medical help if need be. And since then, I have taken such an interest in different reactions. And of course, everything has to do then with people's health. And it's been horrifying for so many of us to realize that individuals were having to die alone. And it could happen to them suddenly. So what has happened to all of us, perhaps, that we now understand, as we perhaps did not understand, that illness could overtake us quickly, and that then we would have possibly to die without anyone we loved. Those things, I think, matter so much, so that what has happened is, what I've noticed among many older people is that they are increasingly grateful for any day that they can still live. I'm talking, to people in their 90s, etc. Any day that they can still be in good health also. So the combination of health and survival and possible happiness. But then we also look around us in this country at the great, great inequality, of course, among how people have to experience the risk of COVID and the risk of dying. So I feel that the pandemic has shown, as almost never before, all possible moral distinctions and questions there can be. It used to be, when I gave talks about medical ethics, I used to say that medicine illustrates in a particularly concentrated way all the moral issues that can arise about illness and health, about lying. Doctors at the time in the 70s often did lie to patients with cancer, for instance, lying and truthfulness, suffering, resilience, overcoming, getting better, or possibly not, death, very much, and survival. All the issues in practical ethics come up with a particular sharpness in medicine, and now I would argue even more when it comes to the pandemic.
Wow, thanks, Sissela, for those thoughts. Really powerful. I want to ask about a few years back. I know that you and Dennis Thompson gave the keynote address at API's 25th anniversary, and you were reflecting at that time on the next 25 years of practical ethics and how we can strengthen the field. And I thought maybe we could ask you to share some of your insights from that here.
When I spoke at that particular anniversary, yes, of API, one thing I wanted to talk about, and I think I began by talking about the fact that there is this great gulf between philosophers who, like Aristotle and like so many others who in past have always said that human lives and practical problems, of course, matter so much to ethics, because why else, as Aristotle said, why else would you study ethics if not to try to work with some of these issues? He put it better, of course. But there have always been those philosophers. And then there have been many others, however, who have said that we can't deal with practical problems unless we solve some theoretical ones first. And there still are people saying that now. And so my argument is that there's this great gulf between the two. And my counter argument to the people who say, first we must solve all the theoretical problems is that then we're going to have to wait a very long time, and we don't have time to wait for all of that. So meanwhile, we are going to deal with practical problems. And then I did bring in Sidgwick and his book, Practical Ethics, and his focus in the 1890s on so many issues in Britain and in the world having to do with practical ethics. Indeed, at that time, he also, one of the questions he wanted to ask was, what is life going to be for future generations? He was asking in 1898. That, and then I segued to wanting to say that for API and all people who consider questions of practical ethics, we now have so many new issues to deal with. At the time, I mentioned, for instance, the Ebola pandemic. Now we're talking about another one, of course, but how are we going to distribute the ways of dealing with pandemics? How are we going to distribute ways of dealing with hunger around the world, but also within our own societies? And of course, at the time, there were issues having to do with very much lying and truthfulness. Those never go away. So I was talking at the time, about 5 years ago, I guess, about the practical issues facing us then. And now I think those are still with us, of course, but intensified by the pandemic.
So given that the sort of practical issues and concerns have driven your work throughout your career, can you tell us what sorts of practical issues you're grappling with now? What are you working on now?
Yes, practical issues that I'm working for. Yes, practical issues, first of all. I am very, very interested in how older people deal with survival and living on at this time. How very differently older people are dealing, in part because of differences in health, of course, and differences in age. And I'm very interested, I always have been, in the notion of resilience. What does resilience really mean? But as I argued in my book on happiness, resilience by itself, unfortunately, can lead to people being very heartless. Yes, you can be so resilient, especially if you don't care very much about other people. And that's why I argued that you need both empathy and resilience. Empathy by its own is also disastrous, because people can become so empathetic they can't live any longer because of all the suffering they see around them. So you need this combination of empathy and resilience. And that is what I'm very interested in seeing, and when it comes to older people, and the issue of survival again. and there I feel I notice so many older people who are talking about the issue of gratitude, how they have learned in a new way. Let's say that they are locked into their apartments, can't go out at all. Some cannot at all, especially if they are in homes for the elderly. Sometimes, they literally have to stay in their apartment and food comes to them, etc. And how people develop gratitude, some better than others, for what there still is. And I have been very touched very recently. I've been speaking to an old school friend living in a village near London in England, in the UK, and she's living under very strict lockdown. So what does she do? She wakes up every morning and she does a little meditating, and then she looks out the window, and every day she writes a haiku. Now, to me, that haiku being a short poem with 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables, to me, that is true resilience. She is doing something creative. She is disciplining herself, and she's grateful that she can do this. So I'm very impressed by what some people do. And again, that notion of gratitude that so many people experience.
And what about your writings now? So are you working on writings in resilience and empathy? And I believe there may be a memoir you might be working on. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, I am working. I did write a memoir, actually, a book called Alva Myrdal, A Daughter's Memoir. And I wrote that. And that was my way, in a way, of keeping my head above water when my mother was very ill. And I wrote, and she also had aphasia, so she could not speak very well at all. And she should have written her own memoir, but she didn't. And so I decided I was going to write. And I had an extraordinary few years doing that. Partly I went, when I was in Sweden, I would go to the places where she had grown up, and I would talk to all the relatives and her siblings. The children of her siblings. And I learned so much about her, but I call it a daughter's memoir because I also talked about the kind of mother she had been and how much her life had meant to me. So now I am also writing a memoir, but from my own experience, starting in my own life, in my studies, my work, my writing, my family, all of those things, and how issues, the moral issues that I've cared so much about, having to do with living and dying and honesty and lying and many other things, how they have woven in to my own experience, and how I have learned about them in so many ways from my experience, but very much, of course, also from the life and the challenges I've had throughout my life. And so that book is an ongoing project, which is all right with me. I have decided I'm not wanting to be having a contract with the publisher or anything like that. I can put into it what I want when I want.
Thank you, Sissela. So Gretchen and Tom, that concludes the sort of questions that Sissela and I wanted to cover together today. But I have a couple, did we cover the ground that you needed to for the interview, first of all, or is there any piece of this that we need to still add in?
I think this has been terrific. Thanks, Jess. Sissela, you are inspiring, and that has been a terrific collection of very rich material. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I like to end these interviews or bring them close to an end by asking maybe a couple of more broad and general questions. Is there something that's come to your mind, for example, during this conversation or as you thought about it, that you have not yet had the chance to say today in response to Jess's questions? We'd love to hear any additional thoughts that you have.
Yes, I'll have to think, because I was there is something, there's another quotation, but having to do with gratitude. And this is the book, Oliver Sacks' Gratitude. I don't know if you remember Oliver Sacks, who wrote in the New York Times when he was dying. And you may not want to have this. In his book, this is a quotation actually that matters very much to me. He says, "I cannot pretend I'm without fear." He has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. "But my predominant feeling is one of gratitude. I have loved and been loved. I have been given much, and I have given something in return. I have read and traveled and thought and written. I've had an intercourse with the world, with a special intercourse of writers and readers. Above all," and this is what matters so much, I think, "above all, I have been a sentient being, a thinking animal on this beautiful planet, and that in itself has been an enormous privilege and adventure." I'm very moved by that, I think, and that's so extraordinary, and that I have encountered in other writers also. The fact of being really grateful you made it into this life at all.
Wow.
Because yes, in my book on happiness, I begin that book by saying I had come across a letter that my father had written to my mother. My mother had one child, my brother Jan, and she had a growth in her uterus, which was going to be operated away, the doctors said. And she had refused because she wanted to have more children. And my father wrote a letter saying, we've always hoped to have good luck, and we did have good luck. And then I was so lucky to be born at all. So I empathize with all the people who feel so glad that they made it into this, as Oliver Sacks says, on this beautiful planet, an enormous privilege and adventure.
And that it certainly is. It certainly is. If you were going to predict the future of research in applied ethics, you've really talked about so many areas that have yet to be explored and that you are exploring. Is there something that you would advise young scholars to think about, to focus on, something that you predict really is important for the future of our world?
I think young scholars really, I very much hope that they will take into consideration what is happening in the world right now, the growing inequality among rich and poor countries, the pandemic unfortunately has made that so much worse. The number of children who have nothing to eat, families nothing to eat, but also the population issues. The fact that there are so many people now, partly because of the environment, and I should add the combination of the environmental crisis and various medical crises and migration. All of those issues matter so much because it's not clear what people are going to do with population pressures, for instance, from Africa to Europe, from Latin America to our country, and how to best distribute what there is to be consumed, how to help people in so many new ways, so that young people, and I often hope that more young people will go into the caretaking professions also. And medical ethics, therefore, and concern for nursing, for instance, nursing so underpaid in our country as in many others. There is so much for practical ethics to do that has very much to do with future generations and what they will have to possibly endure, that And I am very happy, for instance, that President Biden is very much concerned about those issues right now. They cannot be ignored.
That's a powerful list of research opportunities, it seems to me, as well as career opportunities.
I may
Thank you.
want to leave out any political words there.
Oh, I think you've identified an area where many people would probably need or want to do some work in the future. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Tom, who has been a part of so many of these interviews, to think for a moment about whether he has any follow-up questions. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by your approach to practical ethics. Would you characterize it as more descriptive or prescriptive proscriptive?
That's a very interesting question. Maybe, yeah, I'll just have to think. At my stage in life, I'm no longer teaching and writing. I'm here reflecting. And so what I'm doing, I like very much the word exploring. I'm exploring, and so it's not exactly descriptive, it's discovering. I'm trying to discover, trying to understand, trying to explore. And there's a Swedish word for explorer. By the way, I was always very interested as a child in all these explorers, but there is a Swedish word called upptäcktsresande, namely discovery traveler. A traveler a person who travels to discover. And so I want to be, and I called my book, that was my book about happiness, I call it Exploring Happiness. And the publishers kept saying, just call it happiness. No, I don't want to call it just. Moreover, there were hundreds of books called happiness. I just want to call it Exploring Happiness instead.
I'm following from that just very briefly. As a Swede, I mean, growing up in one culture and living in another, is happiness culturally different? I mean, you have lagom and moderation and the collective in Sweden, and you have, let's just say, the rugged pursuit of happiness in America. Mm-hmm. Is it a culture, or is there a universal happiness?
There are certainly universals when it comes to happiness. Even in the poorest country, there are differences among human beings, etc. But I am fascinated by the research, and I'm very glad you bring that up, the research comparing countries and comparing societies. And it's clear that the smaller countries, and in particular countries that have good welfare systems for citizens. So it's often the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Those countries are often singled out, and I mean, they are much higher levels. And that is of interest. And at the same time, within countries, for example, Canada, this doesn't necessarily have to do with people who are richest or poorest, but the parts of Canada where people have greater sense of neighborhood and neighborliness and people caring for one another are doing much better than some of the richer parts of Canada. And that could probably be the case in the United States too. And I haven't followed it in the United States, but it's very interesting. And that one thing, in fact, that got me started. Somebody came to me and said, do you realize that Sweden is among the happiest countries in the world? And I said, I can't believe it. They're always complaining. But the fact is, they felt they could complain. And yes, they had healthcare. Yes, they had dental care. Yes, they had many things that in other countries it was not available.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
That's great. Jess, did this conversation lead to any additional follow-up questions for you?
I believe I wove mine in throughout, so I asked us along the way to elaborate a little bit when I was thinking of some other things. So I think we've covered what I was hoping for, and I just want to make sure that from the production standpoint, you'll be able to put this together in the way that you want to, and that we didn't leave out any formalities or things like that that you need in order to complete the project with Sissela.
That's a wonderful question. And I think one of the things that, Tom, we often ask, and I think a lot of this has been woven into the conversation, but we do want to ensure that we get sort of your bio from your perspective, right? So top to bottom, you talked a bit about that. Is there anything that we need to just work through? Where did you go to school?
Right.
Where did you study? Where did you teach? That kind of a thing. I think we generally ask for a short summary of that. And so that would be maybe something we just want to go through. I know the bio is very long and people could look it up, but it's very nice to hear from you, Sissela, a little bit about your background. Tom, isn't that right?
Yep.
Now, would you like me to start? I mean, really early on, yes. I grew up in Sweden, although, yes, I grew up in Sweden. You see, this gets very complicated. I don't want to complicate it for you, but I grew up in Sweden, though I was spending 2 years in the United States, and my father was working on an American dilemma about what's called then the Negro problem. And I was very little, but one thing that mattered so much to me from then on, and that so many Black poets, scholars and others were coming through the household when I was little and later on. So Richard Wright, for example, is a person who mattered so much to me. And so anyway, I grew up in Sweden, and at age 12, my parents and excuse me, I grew up in Sweden until age 12, when my parents and we moved to Switzerland, and I lived in Geneva. I loved living in Geneva. I loved in so many ways. I went to the International School of Geneva. I had to learn 2 extra languages, or 3, French, English, and German, which was fine. At the time, at first, it was actually agonizing because in the class with the American and English children, when we were supposed to be studying French, I heard them talk English all the time. So I learned English in that class. And in the class with the French and Swiss children, we were supposed to be learning English. They were talking French all the time. I learned French. And it went faster for me than for them in many ways. So I felt, and that was a treasure. And for me, that has been a part of my life always, translating poetry, translating works that I cared about, sometimes translating philosophers. Then at the age of 17, my mother was at UNESCO at the time, and I went to live with her. My father was still head of the Economic Commission for Europe in Geneva. And I lived in my mother's apartment and went to the Sorbonne. And again, I loved that. And studying Sanskrit, philosophy, psychology. Then at 19, I met my husband, Derek, who had come to Europe on a Fulbright scholarship. And we met in the summer of 1954. And he was going to be in Paris, École de Sciences Politiques. And I was at the Sorbonne. We saw each other all that year, and we were married in May the following year. And then I came to this country, and he was in the military. And, you know, there's a limit to how much we traveled a bit, but anyway, settled in Washington, D.C. He was doing his military service, and I was studying at the George Washington University, where I received a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And was a pleasure for me also, and that was a discovery in so many ways. It was indeed exploring in so many ways. And trying to understand also, I was regarded as an alien. This is what I always had, alien something. This is what they called people, and maybe they still do. I had to go to the post office, I think, but I was going to be an American citizen, having because of marriage. And then when my husband got a job in Cambridge, Massachusetts to teach at the Harvard Law School, we moved up to Cambridge, and we had two small children, first one and then another. And I stayed home for a few years, which, and partly I had been looking for work, but I had not found part-time work. I'd been looking for work as a psychologist. So I was home with the children, which I was very glad to be doing, actually, because I was beginning to realize that my studying psychology and working as a psychologist would not have been very easy at all, given how complicated children were. And I had been planning to work as a clinical psychology with problems children were confronting. Instead, I was realizing that I did want to study philosophy, and I did want to study practical philosophy. So I applied, and we took a year off to go to California. My husband's stepfather was very ill. That took another year, and finally I started to study philosophy at Harvard when our youngest child was about 2, youngest daughter. And then in the midst of all that, we had another child 7 years later, our son, and our son Thomas. And by that time I had been working on my dissertation. And so I don't know how much you want me to go on with this. Oh, now I don't hear you.
Mute.
I muted myself because I was entranced by your story. Thank you. So this is, I think, quite perfect. I think you have taken us through, and then some of the other things that you did were reflected, I think, in the earlier opening comments.
Yes.
So you talked about your influences, and you talked about what I would describe as the eternal struggle of balancing the work, the family, the research. It's really an inspirational story, as I mentioned. Tom, anything else that we need to ask Sissela today?
I think we're fairly good, unless the one thing sometimes people like to do is sort of give mention to some of the influences of their colleagues or people in the field that have really impacted on your own work. Who would they be?
Yes. And that could be, a philosopher, yes, starting in Paris. In fact, I could spend a little time on this, but in the international school, a young philosopher, Jean Hersch, who taught the most extraordinary classes about French literature and philosophy, influenced me a great deal. I did not realize at the time that she taught in high school because she couldn't get a job at the university. Now, she had already published books, etc. So she later went on to teach at University of Geneva. Jean Hersch is, I think, a fascinating philosopher. She was a student of Karl Jaspers, J-S-P-E-R-S, who also, when I first came to Paris, and I was 17 years old, I came across a book, Introduction to Philosophy, Introduction à la Philosophie, that still, I think, is most important to me. And it had a little appendix, and which said, what if you wanted to study philosophy, what should you do? And he said, the first thing is you should study the practical problems that people come across. And you should study science, he said. and then you should study the great works of philosophy. And then, so which I still do. And the ones he took seriously were Plato and Kant and Aristotle. And as far as I'm concerned, also Seneca. There's so many philosophers, and Montaigne. I should have mentioned Montaigne in Paris and later on. Most of, certainly Montaigne and Seneca, and in particular, deal with practical issues in their own lives and in the community life in so many ways. Yes, so, and I bring them in very much into St. Augustine being another. Now you see, I shouldn't go on about this. In my book on happiness, so it would be mostly classical philosophers.
Fantastic, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This has been an amazing day, Jess.
Yes, I don't know, Sissela, I know you're running out of steam, but I did actually have a couple other thoughts that I meant to say that I was wondering, and you can decline, but it occurred to me that it might be helpful, since you've reflected so much on your early work and then current issues, if you could reflect at all on all of the work that you've done on lying and the current problems we have with misinformation and disinformation. Do you have any thoughts for us on how to, bring some of your insights into what we're experiencing with that?
The questions of lying, sorry, I need to think it.
Take your time. Take a minute, reflect, and then.
I have been asked to write a new book about lying, and the reason I am not wanting to do that is that I think this is something that is absolutely up to younger people and people who, younger philosophers and psychologists and others, because what they need to deal with right now has to do with several things. The social media in particular. This was when I first wrote about lying. Yes, there was radio. Yes, there was television. But now the ways in which the social media contribute, I think, to the expansion of lies, the dissemination. This is something that I know people are dealing with right now. It would take me a lot of research, really. And at my age, this is why I think absolutely needs to be done. And the second has to do with psychopathology. And we read, for example, of people becoming entranced by things that they ought to know are not true. And again, this is something I did not deal with in my book at all. So I feel that it's so important to take up those issues. And I shall, to the end of my life, I'll definitely keep reading about it and hearing about it and exploring what people are doing. But I'm not the person to do that anymore. The same with my book, Secrets, for the same reason, the media and the various pathologies that we now know so much about, often, by the way, having to do with brain research. And that's another thing, we need to bring in a much more important way. There's something else I should have mentioned also that has mattered so much to me. And that has to do with my father's research on race and everything like that. And, this is something I've gone to conferences and I feel right now, there is, of course, Black Lives Matter. My father would have been so interested, and so much of what he wrote, he brought, as Isabel Wilkerson in her book Caste, she mentions his book several times, and what he wrote about the expression caste, which he dealt with. After all, his book came out in 1944, and he dealt with that issue. And one concept that he brings in, he talks about white prejudice, of course, white prejudice and discrimination. Those are the things he talks about as the major problem for Americans. He talks about The problem being for white Americans, how are they going to deal with this? What can they do to see through their own prejudices? But he also uses the word social distancing. And it's so interesting. In their prejudice, yes, they wanted to be socially distanced from on the basis of race. And now in the pandemic, by golly, it's social distance from everybody. And so that is something, again, we need to really look at.
Thank you. I have one tiny other follow-up question that I was curious about and I forgot to ask along the way. And then I promise I'm stopping and then we can give you a break, Sissela. But I was wondering if your parents' research on population studies, how that affected your own decision to have children.
I have to hesitate. No, is the answer. My parents wrongly thought, when my parents were in their 30s, they wrongly thought that, and they were looking only at Sweden, that population decline was a problem. They really were using that because what they wanted to talk about were welfare issues, health, education, contraception, many other things. And then both my parents became aware of what we now call the population explosion, namely that people were having so many children. Both of them came from families with 4 or 5 children. And I think both my husband and I had 3 children in each of our families. And it's not so much that we were influenced. We very much wanted to have a family, but 3 seemed pretty normal to us, but it had almost nothing to do with my parents' research on population. However, we now understand that fewer children for many people is what is needed.